What was the first book you read?
I don't know. But it was the earliest books I remember are Dr. Seuss books.
Okay. Do you remember any in particular?
Green Eggs and Ham.
Yeah. How'd it hit you?
I loved it.
Yeah.
Go Dog Go. Go Dog Go. That was a really important book for me. One fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish.
See, I don't even know how to read your face here. I actually kind of love that, though. Yeah. We're talking about early reading experiences.
Yeah.
And when you say that's a very important book, I genuinely don't know if that's...
No, I just remember being really, really fascinated with it. I can still remember images from Go Dog Go. Mm-hmm. But I grew up in a family, I grew up in an uneducated family. Mm-hmm. No one in my family even had a high school degree. Both of my parents had taken the equivalency exam, right, rather than finishing high school. And my grandmother, whom we lived with, never went. I don't think she ever got beyond like 8th grade or something like that. But all of my family were really, really big readers.
Oh, interesting.
So they read all the time. They read, what might generally be called pulp fiction. So we had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books in our house, but they were all science fiction, mysteries, westerns, and romances.
I've been in bookstores like that. I mean, there are a lot of used bookstores where they'll have a
right,
small classic section. And then huge,
it's especially places that just do the mass market paperbacks.
Yeah.
So our house, we just had books stacked up everywhere, piled up all over the place. And, I didn't read the romances because that's gross. That's girl stuff, But I read the westerns, I read the mysteries, and I especially read the science fiction. And really early on, and I don't know how this happened, but I decided that I wanted to read what my parents were reading. That is, I didn't want to read kid books.
Oh, okay.
So I learned to read, as I recall, from Dr. Seuss. I don't remember anything before Dr. Seuss, but I learned to read when I was about 3. And so by the time I was 6, I was reading the grown-up books.
It's a good thing you weren't reading the romance books at 6.
It's a good thing that I wasn't. Well, those were pretty tame romances back in the day, you know. So I was reading the science fiction and primarily, but also means like I read all of the Perry Mason mysteries. I read all the Agatha Christie mysteries. I read all Louis L'Amour's westerns.
Are you still? See, I had a similar thing with Agatha Christie. My memory, I think I was mentioning this to you the other day, is Benny Goodman playing in a loop, sitting on this large floral overstuffed couch, and reading every Agatha Christie we had around. It had the little sort of embossed golden medallion on the paperbacks.
Nice.
And I don't think since then I've had the kind of voracious obsession with a single author or a single series. Was that something for you that was largely something in your teen years, your earlier years, or have you had that in your ongoing reading of particular authors?
I got that way. The last time that happened to me was when I read Patrick O'Brien's novels about the Napoleonic War.
Okay,
and
I've heard about these.
The Aubrey Maturin series. This Royal Navy captain, and then his best friend who serves as the surgeon on his various ships, and it's this kind of kaleidoscopic and encyclopedic portrait of the Royal Navy life during the
So it's not just a yarn.
Era.
It's not just a yarn.
No,
it's sort of
it's
a world
way
that
more than that. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it really is. It's sort of world building in the way that almost like Tolkien does world building. It's just fabulous stuff. And I just, I couldn't stop reading those until I got to the end of them. They're just brilliant.
What's your sense of why that usually doesn't happen for adults? Is there a loss of purity? Is there a loss of focus? Is there?
I'm not. I'm not sure that it doesn't happen for adults.
Okay.
What I'm inclined to think is there aren't that many writers who fulfill that particular need or desire.
Okay.
And what I think that need or desire is immersion in a particular world, right? So when you're and that's most obvious if you're talking about something like a fantasy series, And you can see that people they don't read Tolkien once, they read Tolkien over and over and over again because they want that immersion in Middle Earth, and then once they've read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, then they read the Silmarillion, and then they go and find all the backstory and try to fill it. And
they
then
visit New Zealand, they do fan fiction.
Well, fan fiction is one of the most, in fact, if you want to know what are the works that really immerse people in a world, then you ask yourself, what produces the fan fiction, right? And so, there's no more extensive fanfic world than that devoted to Harry Potter.
Have you written fan fiction?
I have not.
If you were to write fan fiction, what would you write it for?
What would I follow? What would
and don't worry about whether you've got the capacity for it.
Yeah,
but just from a sheer delightful.
Yeah, I don't know. I might want to do something in the Harry Potter universe. Okay. I just might want to do that. But you can have it on the fantasy level. You can also have it, it's interesting because it's the sort of thing that you find in fantasy and science fiction, but you also find in historical fiction. Because, so what you can say is that science fiction is giving us an other world of the future. Fantasy is giving us an other world that is kind of sideways to ours, right? Yeah. And historical fiction is giving us an other world from the past. And so that sort of that desire to inhabit a different world than the one that we live in every day is something that only particular kinds of fiction tend to promote. And I think that's true even in the case, for instance, it's not true of all mystery stories, but I do think it's true. The world of Poirot and the world of Miss Marple are kind of fixed, enclosed worlds where you sort of know what the rules are, in the same way that when you go to Middle Earth, you read, you find out what the rules are. In the Harry Potter world, what the rules are. And I think that satisfies a particular kind of readerly desire that I think a lot of people associate with childhood. And so they tend to think that that's the sort of thing that you outgrow or that you're supposed to outgrow, and that something has gone wrong if you haven't outgrown it. Yeah. And I don't think that's true at all. I think that's a very legitimate form of reading and something that it can be really healthy and good to take delight in.
I have an intuition that there's something here about Jesus's calling to become like a child that might be in play. And so maybe the reason that for at least many adults it's difficult to re-enter that stage is because it's also difficult for us to become like little children.
Yeah. And of course there's endless commentary about what Jesus means by that, right? And the most common thing that Americans tend to say today is that, well, he means you should become as innocent as a little child. And to which I always say, have you been around little children recently? Our buddy Augustine here, when he looks at children, he doesn't see innocence. Yeah. But I do think there is something about the receptiveness of children. The power of story over children is I think related to their kind of imaginative, intellectual, and emotional openness. So if you tell them a good story, they're just locked in. And I think that having imaginative, intellectual, and emotional openness is also what is required in order to be converted, right? That is, you have to be open to a life different than the one that you're living. And so in that sense, I think the habit of mind of a certain kind of reader is also the habit of mind of someone who is receptive to being changed by the gospel.
That's excellent. I'd love to know if you could think of a couple of sanctifying books in your life. I'm not looking for Christian text or scripture necessarily, but a couple of books. Yeah. And I think invariably this kind of question is peculiar and idiosyncratic, but that have been ingredient in the Spirit's work of sanctifying you over your reading life.
Yeah, I think you should probably ask my wife how much the Spirit has actually sanctified me over the years. But that's actually a really difficult question to answer because books work on so many different parts of you. Yeah. But this may sound a little strange. If you asked me this another day, maybe very different things would come to mind. But I remember at one point in my life when I was a relatively young Christian reading Isaac Dinason's Out of Africa. which is an incredibly beautifully written book about a person who has found a kind of earthly paradise and then has that taken away from her. And what she begins to wonder is whether the genre of her life is that of tragedy, you know? Yeah. And in fact, the book is organized in 5 books, and it actually has the structure of a classical 5-act tragedy. And she ultimately decides that though it's really sad and painful for one's life to be tragic in form, that's better than it not having a form at all. Like the worst thing is to have a life that doesn't seem to add up to anything. She tells a story in the 4th act, which is clearly a story that she had heard as a child and which she had told to children, about a man who hears a terrible noise that frightens him, and he runs out of his house, and he's trying to escape whatever it is that's terrible. And he runs down this path, and then he falls down and turns around and comes back, and then he falls down again and turns around and goes back this other way. And this whole story goes on about what he goes through and the paths he takes and how he comes to this little pond and how but the whole time that you're telling the story, you're drawing the motions of the man. And then you get to the end of it, and you've actually drawn a picture of a stork. And so she says, you know, how terrible it must have been to be that man, that so many calamities, so much misery, so much fear. But what he couldn't know and couldn't see when he was in the middle of it was he was actually making this beautiful picture, this picture of a stork, you know. And she says, is that what my life is? You know, am I, when everything seems absolutely chaotic to me, am I actually making a picture? Am I making, or the events of my life, is my fate making a picture that maybe someone else might enjoy looking upon? And that was a book that was tremendously important for me, because it got me thinking about one of the things I've thought about most in my life, which is the shape of a life. And what does it mean for a life to have a narrative shape? And which I think is something that Christians for a long time have been, our friend Augustine is still here and is still helping us, right? Because that's his whole thing, you know, is that he comes to feel at a particular point that his life is something that just doesn't make any sense at all. It's not a tragic tale, it's not a comic tale, it's senselessness, right? And he has to find, before he can have any peace, he has to find the narrative order that makes sense of it. And so Out of Africa was a book that set me down the path of thinking about the structure of a human life. And then I'd mention just briefly one other thing. It's not a book, though, you know. So and it's Auden, W.H. Auden's little sequence of poems called the Ori Canonici, the canonical hours. So, I mean, the whole thing is only about 7 poems or 8 poems. It's about 15 pages long. But it is a meditation on the day of the crucifixion, a Good Friday, and any particular year that remembers the crucifixion, and then every day of our lives as, in a way, a reenactment of the day on which Christ died. We die daily. We crucify him daily. He gives us new life daily. And that book, it's not a book, that poem, that little sequence has, I actually tried to talk Edward Mendelsohn, Auden's literary executive, into letting me do a little critical edition of it, you know, and he said, it's just too short. It's just, you can't make a book out of it.
Hey, enough criticism and you
well,
got a
that's
book.
The thing.
That's right.
I would have to have some really extensive commentary. And so one of the things I've actually thought about doing is writing a commentary on that sequence, and then hoping that someday someone would let me put it in the same volume, and then I'd have a book, right? But that's the most profound poem I've ever read, just for me personally. And it is something I would say I think about that poem, or something in that poem, almost every single day.
There's something so mundane about that poem. Something so mundane about the canonical hours.
Right.
This is simply a repetition of the end of Jesus' life,
Right.
that Christians, almost from time immemorial, have repeated, have sought to participate in. So in one sense, it's the most generic Christian form there is. But you've just been talking to me about diligently seeking to discern the shape of one's own life.
Right. Right.
But when you say this personally, so that's what strikes me. It's
Yeah.
not that it's profound in general, but it's personally profound when it's just simply another day.
It's just simply another day.
Or it's just simply the story of Jesus yet again. So can you talk about the way that that's personally profound?
Well, first of all, I think that the canonical hours, so that's it's a prayer every 3 hours throughout the day. So originally 8 canonical hours. Eventually, and I think this is very important, it turns out the human body doesn't hold up very well if it never gets more than 2 hours of sleep at a time, and so those ended up being condensed. But the canonical hours arise out of a question, and the question is one that Jesus asks his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. Could you not stay awake with me even for an hour? Could you not accompany me even for an hour? And the whole history of the canonical hours is really the church's attempt to remedy that. That
institutionally failed.
Yeah, that's exactly
right.
right.
Because we need sleep.
Yeah, that's right. We need sleep. So it turns out we can't. And which I think is a really interesting thing. It's this that our inability to do it, our inability to pray every 3 hours, day after day after day, without falling apart, is kind of a wonderful reminder that no matter how spiritual we want to be, we can't overcome our embodiedness. Right. I think you were telling me recently that you need your 8 hours, and if you don't get your 8 hours, some things happen, and same way with me. After a certain amount of time, I just cease to be functional. One of the really interesting things about sleep is that as I was reading recently, one scientist who studies sleep, and he says there's really only one thing we know for sure about sleep, and that's that if you don't get it, you die. And it's just, you keep animals alive, you keep them awake for too long, you keep people awake for too long, they die. And nobody really knows why. Nobody knows what it's there for. There's some guesses, there's some thoughts. But basically it's this really weird thing that at the very least serves to remind us that spirit doesn't overcome matter. That we can't simply by force of will overcome our embodiedness. And sleep is a regular reminder of that. But we can nevertheless structure our lives in memoriam, as it were, of that day. And so for Auden, I think what's so beautiful about this is he portrays every day as a day in which we awake in solitude, move out into a public world, and then at the end of the day retreat back into solitude. And when we move out in the public world like that, what we do every day is crucify him again. In one way or another, we crucify him again. And there's this utterly spectacular passage at in the fourth of the poems, known as, which is about what happens between noon and 3, right? And he's reflecting on what happened between noon and 3. He says, I can't remember anything, I can't remember what we did. I think I'll go take a nap. I think I'll go have a siesta, and go to sleep. And he talks about how when you go to sleep, he says, our own wronged flesh begins to renew. That when you rest, then the nutrients flow from your stomach out through your circulatory system. The oxygen, fills your blood. You breathe in, you breathe out. The oxygenated blood then goes to heal the body. And so God's promise of renewal, God's promise of forgiveness is something that starts happening in our bodies even before we acknowledge what we have done. That is, that God is well disposed towards us and wants us to be forgiven, is something that begins even before we acknowledge what we have done. It's prevenient grace, right? It's the grace that goes before us, and it's the grace of the body, the grace of the body's functioning. And that just, it is the most, as you say, it's the most mundane thing in the world, but the most mundane thing in the world is that we die daily and we are renewed daily. And so that's why I think of it almost every day. There's some element of the poem that I think of every day, because that ongoing repetition of the work of fall and renewal, resurrection, is something that we experience every day. We can do so more or less consciously, but the more conscious we are about it, I think the more important and powerful it is to us.